2025 was a big rebuilding year for me. To kind of tell you the story of all of that, I'm going to go back to 2024 just to give you kind of a recap of everything that led up to the way that I spent 2025. So beginning of 2024, between basically March and April, I set myself up to build a tiny house. You've seen the tiny house in some of my previous videos. I had the plan to live in the tiny house on a piece of land within a land co-op. All of that was set up and ready to go. I spent 2024 building that tiny house. I financed that through a loan that allows funding for that type of project. And then in late July, my dad had a medical emergency. So that did end up leading to his death. And because I'm an only child and my dad wasn't married at the time, that basically means that I spent most of the rest of 2024 handling the logistics of all of that. I live in British Columbia in Canada. At the time of his death, my dad was living in East Texas. So that was a very big travel issue. I'm just talking about logistics here. It took me, between getting off the island I was living on, getting to the next closest airport, flying to Texas, and then driving to the small town that he lived in, it did take me about 24 hours of time actually traveling to get to where he was. And I couldn't leave the same day. So it did, you know, he had a medical emergency on Wednesday and I didn't get there until I think 3 a.m. on Friday morning, something like very early on Friday morning. So I was able to spend a week with him. He was in the hospital in the ICU that entire time, but he was awake for part of it. And so I did get some really, it was a horrible time, right? Because he's not doing well, but it was also really amazing time to be able to have that time at all versus, you know, him dying before I got there or not being able to interact with him at all before he died. I was able to have some time with him that felt nice despite the circumstances. I'm an only child and he was not married when he died. He never remarried after my parents divorced. So logistically, again, I'm mainly trying to focus on the logistics here. I had to deal with everything. I had to deal with his vehicles. I had to deal with his home. I had to deal with everything he owned. I had to deal with organ donation. I had to deal with cremation. I had to deal with alerting everyone that you're supposed to alert. Dealing with death certificates, all that. Anything that you have to deal with, I dealt with. And so that took a lot of time. I ended up being in Texas, I think a total of 7 weeks between actually spending time with him and then all of the things I had to do after the fact. And so logistically, that took a big chunk out of also getting myself set up at my new property in the land co-op, and obviously it added this huge emotional stress to everything else that was going on. So basically that looked like me then being in kind of a cloud of grief for the rest of 2024 and longer than that, but I'm just mentioning 2024. After the logistics were handled, I road tripped back up to Washington State, where my mom lives. I stopped along the way in some areas that were emotionally significant for my dad and I. And I also stopped in Oregon to see my best friend for a bit. And then I stayed in Washington with my mom for a little while to sort of decompress and figure things out. I was also waiting for the death certificates to be sent to me. It's kind of a long process, or can be. And in order to bring some of his things into Canada, I had to have a death certificate showing that, you know, I was bringing these things in because there had been a death in my family, or it could be really expensive to import certain things. So that was basically the way I spent the rest of 2024. And then beginning in 2025, I really was pouring all of my grief into getting the property set up. And that for me looked like a really wonderful gardening space. That's really what I did with all of this sort of pent up energy around this loss, is I gardened. So I built a large 3-section compost bin from old pallets. I built raised beds from fallen tree logs that I collected from around the property. And I built a porch for the tiny house. It had since been moved to my spot from where it was being built. And I also set up my inflatable hot tub and began building sort of like a nice wood surround for it as well. So I was really trying to settle into my space. And I was also pouring kind of all this extra grief energy into these projects. So my garden was the biggest part of that. And I built several garden beds that I, you know, started seeds for them. I filled them with really amazing soil, which was really expensive. And they then had quite a rough time. I noticed from some of the other creators that I follow that a lot of people had sort of a rough season of growing. And I know where I was, the nursery kept telling me that it was the worst year for slugs they had seen really ever. And that looked like, you know, in the morning I would go out to check on all the seedlings and I would hand pick all the slugs off. And at the height of the slug portion, there were, you know, 30 to 50 slugs every morning. And then I started picking slugs in the evenings as well, and there would be a similar number. So sometimes literally I was hand picking 100 slugs a day off this garden. And once the slugs started to slow down, when it got warmer, drier, less hospitable for the slugs, then the deer and the voles kind of took over and continued eating things and destroying plants, to the point that I really didn't harvest anything for storage. And compared to what I planted, I really barely harvested anything to eat at all. So that was really disheartening, spending all this time, and the act of doing it was really therapeutic for me. So it's not like, oh, I regret it because it didn't turn out well. It was a very good process for me to go through despite the outcome. Even if the outcome had been even worse, it was a really good way for me to sort of target that energy into something productive. And it's literally what got me out of bed in the morning, plenty of mornings. So but it was very disheartening, and I really was looking forward to taking everything I had learned from that grow zone. I had been in grow zone 8B during that time, taking that knowledge that I'd gained about the grow zone, along with the pests that I encountered, along with how things grew, along with maybe I should start some things earlier so they're bigger when I put them out to avoid some of those issues. I was really looking forward to taking that knowledge into a second year in this garden and, you know, seeing the difference and seeing a different level of production and a different level of success. And then summer came around. When summer happened, that was the time when the land co-op was supposed to be solidifying some of the longer term agreements versus the short term agreements while the co-op is getting set up. So by that time, I'd actually been living there for a year and a half, almost 2 years. And so I was really excited about seeing the change from kind of almost a rental agreement situation into the actual purchase agreement and the co-op setup. And that didn't happen. Basically, the agreement was after that amount of time, we would switch over to the co-op and we would no longer be paying rent. We would be paying only payments towards actually paying off the piece of land that we were buying within the co-op. And that agreement completely changed to being still having to pay rent for an undetermined amount of time. The rent was higher than it should have been. We were now having to pay pretty high utility fees on top of that, which were initially supposed to be included. And several other things happened over the course of the year and a half there that just proved to me that this was going to be an untenable situation. I couldn't stay in it. So I started looking around at other options, and really, you know, Vancouver Island is extremely expensive, and a lot of people moved there even before COVID, but certainly during COVID. And so it's impossible to find something that you can purchase with a single income unless your income is outrageous. And basically what that means is I had to start looking at moving off the island, which I really didn't want to do, but financially it kind of became really the only viable option was moving off the island. And I also really didn't want to move back to the US. I am gay and a liberal, and really I'm not even a liberal. I'm very, very far left. So I didn't want to do that because of those reasons. It's really potentially not safe, and certainly looks like it's going to become even more unsafe. So I didn't want to look at options for moving back to the States. So luckily I found this place. I have just under an acre, so that's an acre and a half less than I had at my old setup, but this almost acre is a lot more usable space. And so I decided to buy it. There are a lot of lessons I learned, and taking those lessons and kind of putting them into action means that there are a lot of things that I'm sort of going to leave here in 2025 and not take with me into 2026. And again, I'm going to backtrack to 2024 at the start here. I deleted all of my social media accounts except YouTube in January of 2025. And for me, social media has been a huge thing for age 22 until age 37 or 38. I professionally managed social media for different companies. So I've been very involved in social media during a lot of the changes in trends, especially Facebook and Instagram. And that was my job for a lot of the time, not full-time. It was kind of a side gig. My full-time job though was that I was a photographer I was doing professional photography for like corporate studios, but I also was a freelance photographer and I did weddings and things like that. And so social media was a huge part of my professional life for both of those reasons. I, really put a lot of time and effort into creating spaces that reflected, either the company that I was working for or me and myself. And so deleting all of that was kind of hard in interesting ways. Deleting Facebook was also challenging just from the emotional aspect. I've had friends who have passed away. My dad had just passed away. And so deleting that sort of tangible link to them in a way, even though they're gone, was really challenging emotionally. But really looking back on the last year not having social media, it was one of the best decisions I could make for myself. The way the world is changing makes social media more and more challenging for my anxiety. Even just having YouTube, not necessarily as a creator, but as a consumer, even YouTube is hard. I notice the way the algorithms change because I have also that sort of having done it for a living component. I really pay attention to those trends. And I notice, even though I never did YouTube professionally, but I noticed those trends in the algorithms and the way the algorithm is choosing what to show you, and also seeing the rise in AI and how quickly AI has taken over so many things. I just know for myself, I'm better off not being so entrenched in all. So after that year of being off social media, I don't have any plans to sort of reintegrate social media into my life. I'm going to continue to stay off of it. I also find Meta to be a disgusting company at this point, and so I don't want to engage with any of that. I don't want to engage with their politics, their algorithms. I don't want to do anything that will earn them money. So that's another reason that I really backed out of social media. And I also am fairly low tech anyway, just naturally, I guess. I never got into TikTok. I never got into Twitter. I never got into Snapchat. It was really just Facebook and Instagram that I was mainly sort of tied up in. So I really think moving away from that was really helpful for my own mental health. Along with that, in 2025, I didn't have any streaming subscription services. So I didn't have Netflix or Disney or Hulu, or in Canada we have Crave. I didn't have any of that in 2025 until November. I only set that up once I moved here. And the only reason I did that is because I really needed to balance all of the hard work I was doing getting this place livable with relaxation. And that's kind of what led me to resubscribe to Netflix. That's something that I am not going to be continuing in 2026. So it'll be a very short-term thing. I also was not shopping on Amazon or having Amazon Prime or any of that stuff until November as well. The only reason that I broke that habit is because I live in a place that's very, very remote. And because I'm moving here in winter, there are extremely limited options of local businesses that I can support. I have done as much local as I can. Some things absolutely had to be ordered in because with the winter conditions, I can't get out of this town. The main road out of town has been closed several times. And even when it's been open, the conditions have sometimes been too dangerous for my comfort level. So some things I have had to order. I'm not a Prime member. I will never be a Prime member. And after this initial sort of settling in, I also in 2026 will not be shopping on Amazon at all. You'll never see an Amazon wish list. You'll never see any of that. And I know that is something that is pretty ingrained with a lot of YouTubers, is you know, they're telling you about stuff you can order on Amazon because Amazon's accessible from everywhere, and they've got an Amazon wish list and all that kind of stuff. And I'm never going to support that. I used to live in Seattle. I grew up in Washington State. I've seen how horrible Bezos is pretty up close and personal. I've had a lot of friends that have worked at Amazon, and I want to be clear that plenty of people who work at Amazon do not have those experiences. If you are high up in Amazon, you're probably doing really well. So it is a balance, because if you go based solely off of a really successful Amazon employee, you're not going to know the horridness of some of the things that are going on. That being said, I think Bezos is horrible for the planet. I don't think Amazon is a good model for the planet. And that is a big part of the reason why I'm choosing not to continue supporting Amazon. And so the other piece of moving into 2026, besides of the things I've already let go of for 2025, I'm really going to start focusing on my own sort of compulsion to people please. I have had that habit for really as long as I can remember. It's very deeply ingrained. And, you know, my need to keep the peace and make sure the people around me are happy and doing well means that I often am not taking care of myself. That really manifested itself a lot in having to care for some people throughout the death that I experienced. There were other people involved who I felt I had to care for from my people-pleasing place, and it was really bad for me. I should have been being cared for during that time, and I wasn't. And so that's the first thing that sort of jolted me into this reality of I really have to change this habit. And the second habit, or the second reason, is people-pleasing, I think, really led to me staying in the co-op longer than I should have. There were plenty of red flags going on earlier on in that process, and I really was trying to keep the peace in that situation with the person who was running it and not rock the boat. And so what that looks like is me taking the suffering on to avoid creating any sort of situation with anyone else. And if I had addressed some of these things head on, there may have been a different outcome. I'm not saying I would have been able to stay there. I think it really, I think, went far beyond that. I think the person who's running it is incapable of doing it well. And I don't think that that would have changed if I had addressed any of these things sooner, but it would have saved me from some of the stuff that I went through and the stress that I went through putting up with a lot of that. The other, or the second, I should say, really big thing that I feel I'm leaving behind, not even really by intention or choice, is kind of those beginning stages of grief that happen with any death, but especially with one that is extremely out of the blue. There was no indication that this was going to happen. It was incredibly sudden, and there was a huge piece of my experience that was just shock, absolute shock. And again, I think even when you expect someone to die, there's a level of shock. Even if it's been months or years of an illness and then they die, you will always be shocked. I've been through that as well in other situations, and it really doesn't matter what the lead up is. There is always an element of shock. My dad was my person, and so having that sneak up on me in the middle of nowhere added an extra element of both trauma and shock that I think I haven't experienced before. And you know, one of my best friends died when I was in my early to mid 20s, so I've experienced a heavy loss before, and this one is still heavier and more shocking. And I am noticing kind of the fog of the shock is lifting and sort of lessening, and it's being replaced by kind of a deeper grief. And so I think in 2026 that the depth of grief is going to continue to grow. You know, I think with any huge loss that is, you know, someone who was paramount to your life, that grief never ever goes away. It just changes. And so I'm noticing now a real change in my grief. And so I think that will be hard in 2026, because the shock in some ways is also a shield. Your brain is sort of course you're feeling it, of course you're processing it, but there is a level that your brain doesn't really allow you to go to when you're in that shock. And my brain is allowing me to go to some of those places now. And so I think 2026 is going to be harder in some ways because of that. And I think that that's something that people forget, or not even forget. It's, if you haven't experienced that level of loss, I think people don't realize as the grief changes, in a lot of ways, it does deepen, it does get worse rather than better. And so I'm sort of amping myself up, I guess, for those feelings in 2026, because I think they're going to really heighten in a lot of ways. So the last thing that I'm really trying to leave in 2025 is technological advancement. And I'm not going to go into this a ton in this video, because I'm going to be doing a first video of 2026, and I'm going to go into kind of my plans for 2026 around technology, but also, you know, around house plans and garden plans and, you know, all the to-dos that I have for 2026. It's certainly not a New Year's resolution type video, but it is a, these are the hard goals, these are the soft goals, and these are the hopes and dreams. So I'll go into this more in next week's video for 2026, but I am really going to go back in time as far as technology is concerned, and really start to ground myself that way. I am somebody who has a lot of concerns about where technology is headed. I think AI is dangerous in a lot of ways. I also think that the climate impact of more and more technology is very dangerous, and I don't like tech companies. So for all those reasons, I'm really taking a step back from any sort of technology, especially AI technology, and data mining companies and things like that. And I'll go into more of that in next week's video. I hope if you're interested in the idea of going more analog, and obviously if you're interested in what I'm going to be doing with the house and the garden and the property, I'm going to go into a big overview of what 2026 will look like in next week's video. So I hope you will come back next week and hear a bit more about my plans for 2026. So the